Okay, well, as we move into chapter 13 now, we're going to be talking some more about behaviors that are somewhat rhythmic in nature. And I think I may have mentioned this in a previous recording related to talking about some of the motivation-related behaviors. We're talking about ingestive behaviors, regulating blood sugar level with eating and blood pressure with thirst and drinking, all of these things that we call kind of regulatory behaviors. We describe them in a way that's essentially rhythmic in a way, because of course, blood sugar levels and blood pressure levels fluctuate throughout the course of a day. And over these, if every few hours kinds of patterns, as the blood sugar levels or blood pressure levels fluctuate gradually downward, we begin to feel hungry and feel thirsty, and this motivates us to eat and drink to raise those numbers back up gradually, right? And in the case of sleeping, we might think that this could be something similar to that. Now, whether sleeping is a form of regulatory behavior is not quite clear, but we certainly could speculate that there might be something going on there in that regard. So, of course, what we're talking about here is that this is a rhythmic behavior. It's known infamously as the circadian rhythm. We know there are hormones involved in regulating sleep and waking in the same way that hormones are involved in some of those other motivating behaviors. We know that the hypothalamus plays an important role in regulating our circadian rhythm as it does these other kind of more short scale rhythms. It very well could be regulatory, but of course the question might be, what is it we have to regulate here? Why do we sleep is the question, of course, and what is being regulated or restored when we feel sleepy? So of course, again, the idea is that once we begin to feel that sleepiness and drowsiness, that becomes one of those motivating forces that drives our behavior. In this case, just like when we feel hungry, we go find food. When we feel sleepy, we lay down and go to bed, right? So this becomes the whole question about what might be going on. In fact, these rhythmic behaviors can occur over many different time scales. So the circadian rhythm that we're talking about here is the one defined as a daily scale, but there are many different rhythmic patterns that we might observe, not maybe just in humans, but in other animals, especially that occur in either longer or shorter time scales. And by the way, from the language of dynamical systems, we will use the word period here to describe the actual time scale of a rhythmic behavior here. So the frequency refers to how frequently a behavior is performed in a given span of time, but the actual time interval between the behaviors is now referred to as the period. So in a circadian rhythm, we're talking about periodic behaviors that last over the course, that vary over the course of a day, right, within one single day. But over the very long time scales, we can have circannual rhythms, yearly time scales, right? So whether humans have circannual rhythms or not, that's, we could explore that possibility, but something as simple as migratory cycles in birds and other migratory animals, those would clearly be circannual rhythms. There are those that may occur over the span of months instead, so those, but longer than a day, so those are called infradian rhythms. So we could have in mammals the estrus cycle, in humans the menstrual cycle. Those would be examples of infradian rhythms. And as I had mentioned, eating, drinking, these sorts of things are ultradian rhythms. Now, of course, it's the case here that not all rhythmic behavior is necessarily regulatory, right? So this idea that these ultradian rhythms of eating and drinking certainly are in fact regulatory, but some of the things that are of those longer time scales are not necessarily regulatory behaviors. But so if we ask the question, are circadian rhythms, because they are rhythmic, does that mean they are regulatory? Well, what we're seeing here is that just because a behavior is in fact periodic in this way does not prove that it's regulatory. but it certainly raises the possibility that it could be. So a couple of other terms here when it comes to talking about rhythmic or periodic or cyclical or oscillatory behaviors, all these words would be synonymous with each other here, is that any behavior that occurs in a rhythmic way needs some sort of an external controller that might sort of set its time. And this is called a time giver, although for various reasons we may use it, the German Zeitgeber there, right? So Zeit means time, Geber, I guess, means giver. So in this case, it's the German translation of that. But the process by which an external stimulus sets the time of a rhythmic behavior is called entrainment. So when one oscillatory event causes other things around it to synchronize with it, that process is called entrainment. One example of this is a bit of an obscure example, but it's possible that if you mount various pendulum clocks all on the same wall, as the pendulums swing back and forth, they cause vibrations to travel through the wall itself. And eventually these vibrations travel through the wall in such a way that all of these clocks will ultimately synchronize with themselves. And you can have a whole wall full of pendulum clocks. Now, of course, not many people are going to do such a thing, but if you go into a clock store perhaps, or someplace like that, you could see something of this kind, and then there will be noticing that they are all synchronized with each other, even though they don't necessarily start swinging in synchrony over time because they sync up with each other. That process is called entrainment. Now, in biological systems, the external stimulus that sets the timing is called the Zeitgeber, and through entrainment, it entrains the internal biological clock of the body. And so this internal biological mechanism that's regulated by the external stimulus is called a pacemaker. And so what we have seen previously is that the hypothalamus, especially things like the lateral hypothalamus, which was the hunger on center, could be something of a pacemaker, right? Because it sets the timing of our biological processes involved in eating behaviors, and therefore determines the periodicity with which we eat. But of course, it has a Zeitgeber as well. In that case, it was the variations in blood sugar level, right? But here we're going to be talking about sleeping and the circadian rhythm. So where is our biological clock here, and what is our pacemaker? In fact, what is the Zeitgeber? Well, the Zeitgeber is actually daytime and nighttime. It's the sunrise and sunset pattern. And so, of course, as the sun rises, it's daytime and we wake up. And then when it's nighttime and it's dark, we get sleepy and then we sleep through the night. Obviously, there are exceptions. People can override their biological clocks and will learn to sleep during the day. And especially if you're working a nighttime shift at a job. But anyone who has had to work such a nighttime shift can report that how difficult it is to transition into that kind of shift work and train their body to actually be able to sleep throughout the daytime hours. It takes a little bit of effort. So what we have here is a nucleus. Remember, a cluster of neurons in the central nervous system is a nucleus that is part of the hypothalamus, and it is now called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. So in this case, it is sort of like the lateral hypothalamus and ventromedial hypothalamus, right? Just different little subdivisions of the hypothalamus that have these different jobs. And in this case, the SCN is receiving visual input, right? So in this case, it's called the suprachiasmatic nucleus because if we remember back to some of the pictures we saw of the visual pathways, the optic chiasm was where the two optic nerves kind of join together and cross over and make a little X shape, Greek letter chi. And in that case, there are projections from the optic nerves that branch off and go up into the hypothalamus, activating neurons in the suprachiasmatic nucleus. That particular pathway of neurons is called the retinohypothalamic pathway, right? So that means that we have these receptors, cone receptors, as well as a few photosensitive ganglion cells in the retina that send information about the presence of daylight directly to the hypothalamus. And therefore, this is a visual pathway that really has no role in conscious visual perception. Instead, it is really directly about controlling the circadian rhythm, right? So it's just simply using the eyes as a way of detecting whether it's daytime or nighttime, right? And so, of course, then that's another part of the having eyes. It's not just conscious visual perception, but the eyes are serving as a mechanism that informs the hypothalamus about these events. Now, there's a little more complexity to it. Of course, there can be some oscillatory neurons that kind of respond to light in different ways, even within the retina itself. Some of these ganglion cells, and the pineal gland also plays a role in this, and certainly the suprachiasmatic nucleus communicates with the pineal gland. The pineal gland is the site of production primarily of melatonin, which is the main sleep hormone. So serotonin is converted into melatonin, and that is in fact regulated in part by the suprachiasmatic nucleus and the signals that it sends to the pineal gland. Here's what we know about the suprachiasmatic nucleus. So one of the things that we can do is let's imagine we might lesion the SCN, right? So if we insert a probe that raises the temperature of neurons inside the SCN to the point where it damages those neurons. So these are lesioning studies, if you recall that term from previous chapters on methods. What we'll find is that we do this in rats, and a lot of their rhythmic behaviors that we would expect them to exhibit, eating, drinking, exercising, sleeping, they will do those things, but they no longer do it in a way that is predictably rhythmic in nature, right? There's no longer a consistent periodicity. So when we talk about periodicity, we're talking about the fact that these things occur or recur at predictable, regular time intervals. And the oscillatory functioning of the SCN seems to play an important role in determining and regulating those time intervals. And when they are now disrupted by damaging the SCN, obviously these rodents still know that they have to eat. They will get hungry and eat and drink and so forth, and they will get sleepy, of course, and sleep. But it's just that the predictability and the rhythmic periodicity of it is now affected by this lesion. We also know that if we record the activity of the SCN, we see that the neurons are more active with more firing of action potentials during the daylight period of the day-night cycle, and then at nighttime, these neurons quiet down and they have less overall activity. One thing that we can also see is, let's imagine if we cut the pathways that lead into the SCN and even out of the SCN to other parts of the brain. So not in this case, the SCN is no longer connected up to any potential mechanism that can inform it, especially not the visual pathway, that retinal hypothalamic pathway. It can no longer have any information about when it's daytime and when it's nighttime. And in this case, what we'll see is that the neurons here are still rhythmic in their nature, right? They will still have active cycles followed by inactive cycles, but they don't necessarily stay tied to patterns of, say, sunrise and sunset the way they otherwise would, right? So that, of course, that helps us understand how the sunrise sunset pattern is part of the Zeitgeber here, right? And that helps keep the neurons of the SCN fully entrained to the sunrise sunset patterns, right? And so in this case, without that visual input, we'll see that the neurons are still inherently oscillatory in their functioning, right? But they drift over time away from that actual pattern of sunrise and sunset. And therefore, animals who've had this who normally would exhibit a circadian rhythm, if they have these pathways lesioned out, their circadian rhythms actually become desynchronized to daylight and nighttime. Okay, so we're going to further break the functioning of the biological clock down into these two different kinds of neurons here. So the idea is that there are these M cells, right? And so these are the cells that are more active at by the presence of sunlight, right? And so the presence of sunlight activates these cells and tends to regulate sort of some of the arousal kinds of processes that occur in the daytime, especially in the morning time, as we kind of wake up and slowly increase our arousal levels. And there are a variety of other hormonal changes that happen over the course of the first few hours after we wake up in the mornings, right? And so some of these hormonal mechanisms further regulate things like hunger, right, as we kind of gradually wake up. And separately are the E cells, right? And the E cells are the ones that react more to the presence of darkness and lower light. And so then they are entrained by the sun setting side of the cycle. And these are the ones that are triggering some of the hormonal changes that are occurring as our bodies are winding down over the course of an evening and getting closer and closer to bedtime. Got a little speculative component here that there can be possibly some genetic individual differences, as well as maybe even some experience and activity-based differences between the sensitivity of M cells and E cells. And this could explain why some people are a little more like morning people. They wake up early because their M cells are very active. Other people might be more kind of like nighttime night owl types, right? And it might be because their E cell system is a little more reactive compared to the M cells. By the way, it's also worth pointing out that one of the reasons why many sleep doctors and other professionals who help people who have difficulty sleeping oftentimes talk about concepts like sleep hygiene. And one of the main components of sleep hygiene is to try to avoid screen time late at night, especially cell phones, tablets, and computer screens and that sort of stuff. I don't know if televisions really fall in the same necessary category. It can depend, I guess. But the idea is that these types of screens emit certain wavelengths of light that can be very similar in wavelength to the kind of sunlight that will typically activate the M cells. So in this case, M cells are not just active because they somehow specially recognize the sun or that it's daytime. It's merely the fact that they're being activated by the presence of light. And in the course of human history and human evolution, we would normally only be exposed to that kind of light when the sun is out. And at night, you may have firelight, but firelight is a very different kind of light with different wavelengths. So the presence of lamps, in the last 100 plus years, we've invented electric lamps that has in part changed the responsiveness of M cells. But as it turns out, the kinds of screens used in phones emits even very much more of a similar kind of light as sunlight. And that's why, for example, there can be different settings that you can put on devices like this where you can you can have like a nighttime mode on phones and tablets, which helps to minimize those wavelengths of light. They also make special glasses or screen covers that filter those wavelengths so that it prevents you from kind of messing up your sleep cycle if you have to have a lot of screen time at night. Of course, the general recommendation is just to put those devices away and try to expose yourself more to darkened environments in the later evening. So that way, this helps to deactivate the M cells and activate instead the E cells. So here we're going to talk about how this system gets the pacemaking working, right? So again, the idea is that we have the incoming light from sunlight versus then the nighttime. And this is entraining the cells within the SCN, and we got the M cells and the E cells. But then what happens is that, as I said, there's a variety of other oscillatory mechanisms that regulate the circadian rhythm as well. So we're going to refer to these as the slave oscillators, right? So the SCN helps to drive these various other oscillatory mechanisms in the nervous system. And these are going to control a variety of other different processes that can happen either while we're awake or while we're asleep. So as I had said on the previous slide, there can be certain hormones that begin to be activated slowly over the course of the morning, which plays a role in gradually waking us up and starting to activate certain hunger patterns, for example. And there are others that may be also happening when we're at night, when we're starting to get sleepy, and or even while we are sleeping. There are a variety of different hormonal processes at work while we are asleep. One example I have listed in parentheses there is our body temperature, right? Sometimes over the course of a night, it's very common for our body temperature to decrease. And I know this happens to me a lot, that sometimes, right when you're trying to fall asleep, you're kind of hot, right? And you're like, it's too hot, I can't fall asleep. And then so you kick the blankets off, and then the next thing you know, you fall asleep, and then about 3 o'clock in the morning, you're really cold, right? And then you got to pull the blankets on. And a lot of that really just has to do with the fact that, again, gradually your body temperature is dropping while you're sleeping, and then you do get to the point where you're cold, right? So, but these processes are part of these things. Of course, realizing that another form of regulatory behavior that our body exhibits is body temperature maintenance, right? Your body's trying to keep its temperature at some set point of 98.6 degrees, plus or minus a couple, percentage points of variability there. But in these cases, again, this hypothalamic oscillatory activity within the SCN is driving some of these other rhythmic processes in the body as well, right? So it happens to, like, as the proteins and neurotransmitters, hormones, same thing, right? As neurotransmitters. And of course, my final note at the bottom there is about the melatonin, right? So I said that earlier, that the SCN is going to be driving the pineal gland, especially through those E cells, to produce melatonin at night. And then this is going to gradually start to increase over the course of the evening hours to the point where you get noticeably drowsy. Then once we fall asleep, now we want to understand what is happening during sleep. And in order to understand what happens during sleep, it's tricky, of course, to understand the psychology of sleep, because when people are awake, we can do all kinds of psychology experiments with them to record their perception of stimuli and things of this nature. But of course, we can't do that when people are asleep. So to understand the psychology of sleep, we have to really get into some neuroscience. And so we may do EEG, for example, to just record brainwave activities during sleep. If we want to understand muscle activity, we can record the electrical potentials happening in muscle fibers. We talked about that briefly in chapter 11. And so this is the EMG, electromyogram. And in particular, we might look at this in the face. Very similar technology then is EOG, because now what we'll do is we'll use the same kind of sensors that we use for EMG, but specifically place them around the orbits of the eye. So that way it detects the muscles that control the eye movements. And then this tells us when the eyes are moving. So that's electrooculogram. So what we have here is then from EEG research, we can learn quite a bit about different brain waves, right? And brain waves that are first present when people are awake. So we can do that, of course. We've got alpha and beta rhythms, but then we also have different brainwave patterns that are active when we are asleep. And those, we're going to have differences, for example, in what is called non-REM sleep or NREM sleep. There are slower brain waves called theta waves and delta waves. And then with REM sleep, sometimes this is referred to as paradoxical sleep, because in addition to some of the slower brain waves like theta waves, we also see beta waves as well. But first, let me talk about alpha and beta. Alpha rhythms, as it listed here, is when we are awake but calm, right? So you see they're slower brain waves, 8 to 12 hertz, instead of the faster beta rhythms, 13 to 30 hertz. By the way, hertz here refers to how many cycles per second. So when we talk about brain waves, we're talking about detecting whole pools of neurons, large populations of neurons that are all firing together in some synchronized pattern, large enough that it can be detected by the sensors on the scalp during EEG measurement. And when those neuron groups are firing around 8 times per second, up to 12 times per second, we're going to call that 8 to 12 hertz, right? And those are alpha rhythms. When they go faster, then we're into beta rhythms, 13 to 30 hertz. Notice the difference here is that beta rhythms are also described here as being desynchronized. And if you think about it, this makes some sense, because this is when we are awake but alert and active. So you know, when you're up and you're thinking about things and walking around or driving a car, for example, you're kind of attending to a lot of different stimulation, and you have to pay attention to different things and do different things. And so this means that different parts of your brain suddenly all have different jobs, right? So it kind of makes sense that not only is neural activity kind of faster, but it makes sense that it would be unsynchronous because different parts of the brain doing different jobs at different times, clearly they are all doing their own thing. But when we are trying to calm ourselves down, so maybe you're trying to do something like get into a meditative state to calm your brain down. And one of the things you do in a meditative state is you try to ignore external stimulation and just calm your brain down into a single activity, into a single thought, right? You just focus on one thing instead of many things. And then, of course, that means the neurons can synchronize because they all do the same job now rather than 50 different jobs at the same time. So not only does the brain slow down when we are, say, meditating, but it becomes more synchronous. But even if in the case that you're not meditating, anytime that you're just relaxing, or especially if it's like getting close to bedtime and you're starting to get sleepy, so you just lay down, put the head on your pillow and close your eyes. You're supposed to be trying to, you know, get yourself closer and closer to sleep. And so your brain waves should be slowing down into those alpha rhythms just prior to falling asleep. And then after you fall asleep, we see that further slowing into some of those other slower waves like the theta waves and delta waves that I mentioned earlier. Of course, a lot of times we might have trouble falling asleep because you lay down and close your eyes, but you're still thinking about a million different things and you just can't get these thoughts out of your head. So you stay in beta rhythms because you just can't get the brain to, you know, calm down, right? But as is noted here, slower waves, and then with REM, as I said, paradoxical sleep, because we get the slower waves, theta waves, while we are in REM sleep. But REM is also associated with certain fast waves like the beta waves, as if we are also awake at the same time. Of course, this is oftentimes, as I have labeled it here, the dreaming state, at least when it comes to the more vivid dreams. People still dream during non-REM sleep, but certainly when it comes to reporting the most vivid and detailed dreams, that this occurs during REM sleep. So it kind of makes sense that you might see some beta waves there for that. And of course, the EOG also reports showing the eyes are moving during REM sleep, hence why it's even called REM, which is standing for rapid eye movements. So I have here a slight typo. I'm going to fix this real quick here. So pardon my closing of the PowerPoint. I'm going to bring that right back, but 4 stages. In green there it says 3 stages previously, but it's really 4. And I have all 4 of them listed there below. But let me talk about this because there's a reason why it used to say 3 stages, and there's a reason why I changed it. I just didn't make the changes to everything on the slide there. It really just depends on who you're reading, right? And a lot of times textbooks like to just focus on 3 stages of non-REM sleep, right? And so it might be the case that our textbook actually specifically says 3 stages as well. Certainly a lot of introductory psych books, when covering this content in a chapter, will also list 3 stages. But technically speaking, when you go look at journal articles and you read the research here, there seems to be more of an agreement that we like to call it 4 stages. So, you know, I don't know why these things work the way they do. But so let me specify the difference. First is stage 1. These are, again, these slower waves. So we saw that the alpha waves were 8 to 12 hertz. So as soon as we drop below 8 hertz, we're going to get into 7.5 hertz or slower, down to 3.5 hertz. And these are the theta waves, right? Now with stage 2, we see still theta waves are occurring, but there are other things happening during stage 2. So we're going to see occasional little bursts of higher frequency activity. So that's a little funny, right? This idea that the brain waves are slowing down, but every now and then you get this very short little burst of high frequency waves that kind of just come and go very fast. And these are called sleep spindles. And every now and then we might see some low frequency patterns that have a high amplitude. So the neural pattern just kind of spikes with a high amplitude, even though it's still a fairly slow wave, and that's called a K complex. And then we move into stage 3. And what happens is that delta waves are happening. So now these are even slower, slower than 3.5 hertz. And they also have a higher amplitude. So now the waves go from being kind of fast, the short amplitudes, to these higher amplitude slow waves. What makes my 4 stages different than what you see in the 3 stages in most textbooks is that a lot of times most textbooks will kind of collapse stages 3 and 4 together and say, once we start seeing delta waves, we're in stage 3. But as I said, a lot of journal articles will make a distinction between the stage 3 when delta waves first start appearing. And what's going to happen is that there's going to be this period of time where you see delta waves kind of appear and then they go away and we go back to theta waves. And then again, a couple of delta waves come by and then we're back into theta waves, right? So here in this stage 3, delta waves are just kind of intermittent. But then once we get to another stage of stage 4, then it becomes very cleanly just all delta waves. So it just becomes a very pure delta wave pattern. And this really is the real definition of stage 4. It is distinct from stage 3, right? So instead of collapsing 3 and 4 together, they just say as soon as we see a single delta wave here and there, we're in that third final stage of sleep. It makes sense to distinguish the first part, which is more of an intermittent thing, and then stage 4, you get this really strong, consistent delta wave pattern. And that's that deeper stage 4 sleep, right? So this graph is kind of interesting here. It kind of shows the amount of time spent either in different kinds of sleep or awake in comparison to that over the 24-hour period on the y-axis there of these different kinds of sleep. And what's very interesting here is the x-axis is age, right? So what we're seeing here is that throughout our childhood years, all the way up to about age 9, just a little under that 10 mark there, we see kids spend a lot of time asleep, right? Newborns, for example, they're spending 16 hours out of a 24-hour day sleeping. And it's about a 50-50 breakdown between REM and non-REM sleep. But then once we get to about 1 year of age, they're still doing a lot of sleeping, 12 hours a day or so. But the proportion of REM sleep is where we start to see the decline. Non-REM sleep stays pretty steady state up until about age 9, right? And it's the REM sleep that begins to decline, and that breakdown further begins to diminish. But of course, now both forms of sleep decline. So as we move through adolescence and up into age 30, we're really dropping all of that. And then of course, even beyond that, age 60, age 90, even the non-REM sleep is really starting to decline there. And so this is a pretty consistent pattern that we see in people, is that the older we get, childhood is a time of heavy sleeping, and that declines slowly over adolescence, and then all throughout adulthood, moving well into our later adulthood years, we need less and less sleep. This is another clue that might help us understand some things about the importance of sleep, and especially the function. Why do we sleep? And many things happen during sleep. As I said, there are all of these slave oscillators that regulate various hormone processes. Well, guess what one hormone crucially is high in sleeping? Growth hormone. But of course, growth hormone is something that we primarily deal with in childhood. So sleeping is a time in childhood for a lot of growth, especially in that first year of life. Think about this: a newborn typically averaging about 7 pounds at birth, typically triples their birth weight in the first year of life to be over 20 pounds by the time they get to their first birthday. And all of that's happening primarily during sleep. So in this case, in the first year of life, your job really is to eat, sleep, and grow, right? And so we're seeing a lot of the a lot of that sleeping occur throughout all of these childhood years, because of course this is growth. And once we get past puberty and our growth spurt and everything like that, our need for sleep pretty rapidly declines. But it doesn't go away altogether, of course, because clearly there are other things we do with sleep. Why is REM so high in infancy? Is this when growth hormone also is happening? There's other speculations about other memory and learning processes that are active in the brain while we are sleeping as well. And so, of course, childhood is a time when where experience is very, very important, right? We've also talked about this in the neurodevelopment chapter about the importance of enriched experiences in early childhood playing an important role in synaptogenesis and keeping synapses and neurons alive, right? And if you are in a deprived environment, we end up with less arborization in the brain. So it may also be the case then that sleep and REM, sleep and dreaming, plays an important role in consolidating the experiences and memories and things that are happening, and then therefore triggering a lot of these metabolic processes and neurons that are relevant to the arborization and myelination of the brain. And by processing those experiences, we're going to see all of this extra sleep process maybe playing a role in some of the hormonal changes that are important for the arborization in the brain. But of course, once we get past those years where the brain development is largely, already complete and determined, and again, we have less of a need for some of that, right? So here we have a list of things, right? So non-REM. So I have already listed this one here, right? This gradual decrease in our body temperature that happens over the course of a night. And as I just mentioned, the increase in growth hormone. So explaining, of course, why growth is important in childhood and why we sleep more in childhood. I also noted this previously that while dreaming does occur in non-REM sleep, it's not especially vivid, fewer dreams and less detailed. But something that can happen are these night terrors. These are things sometimes reported in children where they just fall asleep, and as they're moving into stage 1 or stage 2, they suddenly just jump awake and scream, right? And so not easy to explain what these things are, but it just does happen sometimes. What we're seeing with REM sleep, though, is that we have, again, if you wake, the reason with the dreaming, how we associate dreams with these different sleep stages is a lot of times researchers, when they do sleep studies, will be monitoring their EEGs, and they will wait for someone to be in a particular stage. So whether they're non-REM, stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, et cetera, versus REM, they will wait for them to be in that stage, and then they'll go wake them up. And then they'll ask them, I just woke you up. Were you dreaming just before I woke you up? And they will ask them to try to report back the details of the dream. And what happens is that sometimes with non-REM sleep, people may say, no, I wasn't dreaming. Or if they say they were dreaming, they're not able to recount a very clear, detailed description of that dream. But when people are awakened during REM sleep, they oftentimes are capable of providing a very detailed description. What we see from the EMG research is that during REM sleep, the body exhibits what's called atonia, which means that all of these motor neurons are being inhibited. So we see no activation of any potentials in the muscle fibers, except, of course, for the eye movements, right? So outside of those eyes darting back and forth during sleep, the rest of the body is essentially paralyzed, right? So that's an interesting finding. I've heard people speculate before that this is so you don't act out your dream, but that it seems that there's no real way to demonstrate definitively that that's really why atonia happens, right? So why are we sleeping? I've already kind of previewed these facts, right? So this idea here that we may need to somehow solidify and consolidate the events that have happened to us over the course of the day to help store that learning and that memory into the brain. Now, we could say that's somewhat speculative, but at the same time, we have a little bit of evidence to support this. First piece of evidence is we know what happens when people are sleep deprived, right? So if you are without sleep, what you find is that your memory stinks, right? You have trouble remembering things. And if you go several days at a time where you're just not consistently getting any good sleep, your overall cognitive performance declines. Not only is your long-term memory impaired for forgetfulness, but your short-term memory and attention span also become impaired. Just in general, we see cognitive performance really go down the drain. So it seems clear that there's something that's important about sleep that helps rest and recuperate our cognitive performance, but also maybe in encoding these memories. One thing to think about, for example, what does it mean to rest and recuperate cognitive performance? If you've ever, you know, I'm sure we've all experienced this, right? This idea that sometimes you're doing something that's very mentally demanding, like you could be reading textbook kind of stuff, right? And you're doing difficult homework problems in some kind of a class, and you're just doing a lot of work, or maybe you're writing a paper, right? And that requires a lot of concentration. And you do this for several hours, and even though you're not physically doing a lot of things, you're just sitting at your computer and you're writing and doing your homework and writing your paper, whatever it is. You get tired anyway, right? You get mentally tired, and you feel like that feeling of brain fog that comes from just all of that mental hard work you've been doing. And sometimes we'll just take a break, right? And by taking a break, what we're doing is we're just doing something else that doesn't require so much attention and mental effort anymore, right? So sometimes it could be just actually maybe laying down and taking a nap, but many times we don't bother with that. You might just like put the homework aside and then just watch television for a little while, right? But a lot of times when we watch television, we're not doing something that requires too much concentration, right? If you're just watching, like, imagine watching a movie, right? You're watching like Star Wars or something, and the idea is that you just got to sit back and enjoy it. You don't have to really think too hard. You just watch, you look at the action. And it doesn't require that you have to use that kind of high level cognition to be able to enjoy the performance, right? Or maybe we just sit on our back porch and look at the trees, right? But the idea is that's what I do. Is you just you're resting the part of your brain that has to do all of that work, right? So you're still awake. You're just not necessarily using those parts of the brain that are involved in that kind of difficult, hard work, right? But it might be the case that there's an even more important kind of rest that occurs while you are asleep. So that just occasionally taking those little mental breaks, like I'm describing here, are not enough, right? And that what you need to do is actually be asleep for some period of time in order to really properly rest those systems, right? But this stuff about encoding and solidifying memories, this comes from research where we're looking at the hippocampus in rats. Remember, the hippocampus's job is to encode long-term memories. Actually, we're going to have a little more detail coming up in the very next chapter here on how memory encoding works in the brain. But what we find is that there are neurons in the hippocampus in rats called place cells. And when rats are learning certain different kinds of spatial tasks, so like learning a rat in a maze kind of a thing, but in this case, it's more of a food search task. So you have a complex environment where food is stored in specific locations, and they learn how to search their environment and find the food source. We find that these cells are active during the task, right? And so we're going to call these place cells, because as the rats are learning how to navigate this environment and locate the food source, these neurons are very specifically active during the task itself. But what we then find is that later when these rats go to sleep, those exact same neurons are now still active. This is sometimes referred to as reverberation, right? It's like a lingering echo of the activity that we saw during the task, and now it's reactivated during sleep. And that does seem to suggest to us here that whatever it was that these neurons were doing that was important for the learning and remembering, it needs that reverberant activity during sleep in order to really ensure that the memory trace is encoded. And by the way, when you do this research, you can also try to deprive the rat of sleep, right? So in this first study that I'm describing, they simply just let the rats sleep and then they record their brain activity while they're asleep. But in these other situations, if you deprive the rats of sleep after they have performed this learning task, what we find is that the rats do poorly in when it comes to remembering where the food is hidden in this search task. And it's seemingly to suggest that, again, that by preventing those place cells from having that reverberant activity during sleep, it interferes with their ability to continue to perform this task later. How do you deprive rats of sleep? This is one of those kinds of crazy things. There's a few different ways to do it, but one of the ones that I remember learning about is that these rats tend to hate water. So what they do is they put them on a small, tiny little platform in the middle of a pool. So that way they can't sit down, because if they sit or lay down to sleep, they get wet. And so they have to stay up on their feet in order to keep from getting wet. And since these rats hate getting wet, this is how they'll keep them awake. And then they do that. And then they show again that these rats, when given that search task again later, they just do terribly at it. And here we see human studies. So we do the PET scans here. And so we give someone a serial reaction time task. What this involves here is a series of different stimuli that occur at different locations on the screen. And you have to have differential responses to each one of these, push different buttons on the screen. And so you learn and you get better at this task over time. And then we will do some PET scans while you're doing the task. And then we'll have you go to sleep. And we see the same areas in the brain that were active during the task are also active during REM sleep later on. So again, there's sort of that reverberant activity seemingly to suggest that this kind of skill acquisition that you had acquired needs some additional, sleep repetition later on, right? To round out this chapter here, we want to talk next about how do we wake up, right? And how does the brain know when it's time to wake up? So of course, there has to be some hormonal mechanisms here that is sort of will start to change that gradually tell the brain that it's time to wake up. And curiously, of course, this means that it's not necessarily driven by our eyes detecting that the sun is up, right? Because with our eyes closed, they may not detect the sunlight. But on top of that, something that we have here, the reticular system, and we've talked about this a little bit before when talking about the organization of the brainstem, is that it essentially serves as a blocker, right? And the sensory signals coming in from cranial nerves, facial nerves, and from the body all have to pass through the reticular system here, and it's because it serves as something of a blocker. What's happening is that any stimulus that is activating your sensory organs during sleep is not allowed to move into the cortex, where you would then notice it, right? And this is what helps, of course, keep you awake, or sorry, keep you asleep, because you don't want to respond to everything happening in your environment while you're asleep, because then you're not going to be asleep. So little sounds and lights and other things that might be going on around you while you're asleep just simply don't make it into the brain, because the reticular system is filtering that stuff out. And so, of course, when the sun comes up, you might not notice that because the reticular system is filtering out that sunlight, right? Except what's also happening is that these hormonal changes during sleep will gradually result in the reticular system kind of gradually letting more and more sensory input through and up into the brain. So typically what might happen as you are kind of slowly waking up in the morning is you become gradually more aware of your environment, right? You might start to gradually be aware, oh, I think it's getting lighter. I think the sun's coming up, or I think I heard something, I heard a sound, but then you kind of drift back off to sleep, but you gradually wake back up again, and everything starts to be a little bit more clear as more time goes on. Because what's happening is that gradually the reticular activating system is gradually reactivating the brain. And by part of what's doing that then is letting more of that sensory signal up into the cortex, but also regulating a variety of other hormonal processes that are part of the waking up, including serotonin, right? And so some of these hormonal and neurotransmitters that are important for regulating overall arousal levels in the brain, serotonin, epinephrine. These will gradually begin to help wake us up, right? So what we know in this case is, if we can do some studies here, that if we insert some electrodes into the reticular system to stimulate those neurons, we produce a waking EEG, aka alpha and beta rhythms, right? So of course that seems to be where some of this is coming from, with the alpha and beta rhythms, right? Of course, that's what happens normally when we wake up, is we will wake up into an alpha state, but as we gradually wake up even more and actually get up out of bed and start walking around and doing things, we will move into those beta rhythms. What we'll also see, of course, is that if the reticular system is damaged in some way, and so again, you can do this in animal research, or you may actually have a few unfortunate individuals who may have a brainstem injury that has damaged and lesioned their reticular activating system. And the result of this are very slow wave EEGs. And of course, that means a person cannot wake up. They're in a coma, right? Without the activation of these neurons, then they're going to remain in that slow wave EEG signal, and they will be asleep and not be able to wake up. So clearly, we don't want that happening here. And here's a picture that just kind of basically illustrates the general idea. We see the sensory inflow coming up through the spine and other nerves connecting, synapsing up onto the brainstem, passing through the reticular system, and then allowed to pass on up through the hypothalamus, and not to mention also the thalamus and up into the cortex. So again, in this way, the reticular activating system is regulating the flow of that sensory input up into the higher parts of the brain. All right, we are now done with this chapter.